Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, welcome back to Lunch and Learn at the Museum of American Finance. I'm David Cowan, the president of the museum, and I'm joined today by Alexander Heffner and Rob Johnson on the topic of the dual pillars of American finance and democracy. Alexander is the host of The Open Mind, which is on PBS on Saturdays, and I can tell you that civil discourse still exists on that show. He's been either written or profiled in Time, Reuters, The Washington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, RealClearPolitics.com, and on television from mediums as far-ranging as C-SPAN to CNN and MSNBC to the BBC. Now, he will be joined in conversation with Rob Johnson, who serves as the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He's also a senior fellow and director of the Global Finance Project for the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute in New York. He is a consultant to investment funds for their portfolio selections and strategy, and he served on the United Nations Commission of Experts on International Monetary Reform. Previously, Rob was a managing director at Soros Fund Management and also at Bankers Trust, where our paths did cross briefly. He has served as Chief Economist of the U.S. Senate Banking Committee and Senior Economist of the Budget Committee. Alexander and Rob.
Thank you all for being here today. It's a pleasure. Thank you to the leadership of the museum. Thank you to Rob. As I was saying, fortuitously, Rob and I had the opportunity to meet as keynoters in Copenhagen at the University of Copenhagen's relatively new Center Institute for Bubble Studies. And the conference was on the future of democracy, specifically the economics of post-factual democracy. And what that implied was there is a question today as to whether electorates are informed in making choices about the democratic process. And if they're not informed, are we misinforming the form of government that we think that we're practicing on a day-to-day basis? And so those are the questions that we contemplated, and I specifically, with my background in media, considered a public media approach and how that's instrumental in ensuring whether or not we live in a factual or post-factual or fictional democracy. And Rob obviously brings decades of expertise in economic matters to consider how this moment, in terms of profit, in terms of prosperity, in terms of productivity, how this moment compares historically to previous decades when he served in the private sector or for the Senate Banking Committee, and whether or not that has a strong correlation with certain democratic norms that are either strengthened or being undermined, and what steps we can take moving forward as private citizens, as economists, as citizens and media and citizen journalists too, to correct what might be some systemic dysfunction in that relationship between economics and democracy. When it seems that the stock market is not a reflection of some instability in the political contours of this country and globally. In other words, we are not fearing imminently a great recession or depression in the way we were in the 07, 08, 09 period, and yet the democratic norms that we seem to prize as a country are in jeopardy increasingly. Why is that not reflected in the markets?
With regard to the stock market, first of all, in any kind of literal, mechanical, rational sense, doesn't qualify. And in any kind of, and I don't mean in a short period like a week, I mean even over several quarters or what have you. In a 20-year time frame, there's a whole lot of coherence. But it's not coherence about the well-being of society. If you would say what was good for General Motors is good for America, sometimes. And we are in a period now where it is very clear in the era since globalization that the relative power of people is diminished and the relative power of concentrated wealth and corporations is very high. And the bargaining terms all over the planet, now this isn't an American problem, reflect that. So you see profits are very high and wages haven't kept up with productivity for 20 years. You see, the median living standard of the American is down over the last 15 years and approximately level with where it was 30 years ago. So if it were a barometer on society and the enthusiasm in a broader democratic representative system, it would look different than it does where it is what you might call ringing the bell of the enthusiasm for profitability, which comes sometimes in conjunction with prosperity, but in this instance, I think at the expense of broadening of prosperity.
I know that you have constructive insights into how we make those things more consistently correlated, so that it is not just haphazardly in conjunction with growth that livelihoods of folks improve. That seems to me, when you go upstairs and look at the gallery and see the sustained societal growth and individual improvement as a function of bonds and real measures of a social class that was together improving as a whole, even with some stratification. A lot of the new economic thinking that you're emphasizing in your work is taking scholarship and the present economic moment and trying to formulate a plan for how we can achieve growth and also sustained improved living conditions.
Yeah, I'd say growth and development are different things. And the quality of life which fosters confidence, faith in corporate leadership, faith in governance, a notion of legitimacy, a notion of, my dad was a doctor, and he used to take me on house calls. He was a urologist, so most often it was somebody passing a kidney stone. And he used to say, you know how you make somebody feel better? And I said, well, you give them some Demerol? And he said, no, that comes later. He said, the first thing you do is when someone's in pain, you tell them it'll be over in a couple hours. People can bear transient pain, but despair comes when you don't see any end to the pain. So coming back to politics and coming to this recent election, and I'll get to what I think are the underpinnings in a moment, but I see that Donald Trump, in ways that people don't quite appreciate, was extremely courageous in calling out a dysfunctional system. He came to this body politic, he knocked down 16 Republicans and then obviously Hillary Clinton in the general election by saying the system is rigged. Now, diagnosis and prescription are different things. I always like to quote music lyrics, and I've always said that the old Detroit band where I grew up, the White Stripes, have a song called Effect and Cause. And the second verse of that song goes like this. I ain't the reason, you gave me no reason to return your call. You built a house of cards and you're shocked that you saw them fall. Well, I ain't innocent, in fact the reverse. But when you're going to the grave, you don't blame the hearse. You're like a little kid screaming at your brother after you lost his ball. And what I think is that both parties, both establishments, got so enamored of money, and as money became more concentrated in fewer hands, that meant representing fewer people. And how would I say, intellectuals like I work with who aspire to chairs at prestigious universities, who aspire to being quoted in the media or getting an op-ed column, aspire to government positions like the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, start dancing to the tune of making everything look like it's good news, and it wasn't. Going back to our Danish experience together, he knows this because he's already seen this movie. What I said to people was that they were concerned about post-factual democracy, and to some degree, structurally, with this internet and hyper-intensity of being bombarded with things that are synthetic or false but generate wealth through tantalization, that they have a good point. But I have a problem. I grew up in Detroit, and while I was growing up, my father's friends, my dad was fine because he was a physician, but the auto executives and what have you were starting to do things like have sclerosis of the liver, be chronically depressed, take their own lives. And the story that was told to America was the American dream is okay, despite the velocity and the violence of the decline of Detroit, Michigan. The system's okay and you're okay. There's corrupt black, meaning African American, public administration that screwed things up, and the entrepreneurs lost their mojo. In my opinion, that was utter BS. That was designed as an anesthetic for the fears of the rest of America, not as an analysis of what happened to Detroit. So as I'm leaving high school and I'm going off to MIT to college, start learning about equilibrium economics. Now, you talk about a Disney movie. What you're talking about when you're talking about equilibrium economics is a happy ending, pre-decided. That's where we're going. We're going to have a happy ending. But they didn't say, if you do all these things, you get a happy ending. Equilibrium economics is as though it is foreordained, the natural order of things, and a just order. And I think that's utter nonsense. So I didn't think we were in a world of fake news. I think I grew up in a world of fake reality. So it's a whole lot muddier than what's just happened with the internet. But this democratic system now is poisoned by money, and you can understand that. I don't mean poisoned by money, it's poisoned by the influence of money on social design.
Right. I think that folks would point to the proliferation of lobbyists in that class as infecting and being the tentacles that poison the well of any beginning legislation. Sometimes there's a specific approach to a policy, whether it's healthcare and the energy sector, but the lobbying class was born from the outset of this country in the sense that it represented people across professions and their interests. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with nonprofit groups or even political organizing groups absorbing capital and advocating on behalf of technologists or miners or any particular sector. But how do you distinguish between the system where those interests are defended and yet there is some basic integrity in the process?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think there's some distinctions here that are there's some nuance worth exploring. The first one is, it costs way too much to run for president or senate. In the House, they use a thing called gerrymandering, so it doesn't need to cost so much to hold on to your seat. The people in the House, or excuse me, in the Senate, could say, for the good of the republic, we want to do campaign finance reform, but they know when they're an incumbent, they have an advantage, because they can sell policy right now for next 2 years as they're getting ready to run for re-election, whereas a challenger can only promise to sell policy contingent upon being elected. And so you have a very interesting process whereby, how would I say, the need to sell policy depends on something else, which is how much it costs to be elected. We as a nation have a communications policy. We sell bandwidth for radio, for television, cable, etc. And we put these things up for auction, and people buy them, and then they run their networks, and they're renewed every so often. What we don't do is say in that charter, so much of your time every other year, because we have elections every other year, has to be set aside for the equivalent of public service announcements, so politicians don't have to have so much money to appear regularly in the media. So now Procter & Gamble's selling soap, Citibank is selling you good feelings about finance, and Jeff Merkley from Oregon is selling you for his re-election at the same price. And that's a very expensive price. So at some level in our social design, we don't have public financing of elections, and we have very expensive costs at the level of state or at the nation. What's the numbers people, Tom Ferguson, who's my research director, is just putting out. Hillary Clinton cumulatively raised $1.6 billion, and Donald Trump, who claims it was all self-financing, $900 million in that presidential election. Well, they're not, these people are not just out there, and, you know, some people are out there for goodwill. You know, you write a check for this or that. But a lot of this lobbying, a lot of this is buying policy. And a lot of the reason it's able to buy policy is because the politicians can't resist it and it survive. And that's what's wrong in this system. Now, the presence of lobbyists, information, advocacy, and so forth is very good. I'm a little bit concerned about the scale of people who are allowed to set up think tanks with tax-deductible money in order to lobby. I don't think I necessarily agree with the founder of think tank. I sure have met a lot of people in the last 7 years that don't agree with George Soros, who's one of the big backers of my tank. So you can understand why people don't want their tax-deductible money that could go to close the budget deficit or rebuild the infrastructure now to advocate, say, George Soros's views or the Koch brothers' views or the Walton family's views. So you got now, on the other hand, somebody who's doing something like creating medicine for people in Africa or whatever, I think that's a beautiful piece of humanity. It's sort of like what we should have done with foreign aid. Creating a museum like this, I think that those things should be tax deductible. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a real muddy line right now where people get to shelter their income from taxation to use for political advocacy. That's almost the same thing.